As a member of the Beaton Stricter Particular Baptist Church, it was the normal custom for women to cover their heads in worship. Men would pray openly and women remained silent in prayer, but they sang hymns. However, the customary practice of head covering can take on a different meaning when one's mind is not governed by the spiritual truth of the Scripture. This is demonstrated in my book, Beaton Stricter Particular Baptist, under the heading Hats or Head Coverings for Ladies, page 212. Quote, "Trouble was on its way in the form of religious oppression. On Sunday morning in 1983, I took to church a friend of mine's daughter. This was the daughter of Dick Holmes, who I used to work with as an aerial rigger. She had been through a divorce and was having a difficult time. I suggested she come with me to church as she needed help from God. She was dressed in tight black trousers and a short top, which showed all her figure. She had long blonde hair and her face was made up. This mode of dress was a striking contrast to the elderly ladies who dressed very modestly and all wore hats or head coverings in the church. Unfortunately, this was a bit too much for Mrs. Everett, who came up to me after the service. I call it a meeting because the meetings of the New Testament churches were not called services. And she said to me, 'The next time I bring a female to the chapel, I should tell her to wear a hat.' Mrs. Everett said that all gospel standard churches insisted women cover their heads, and so we should do so. I responded to that by saying, whatever others do, that was their concern. They were wrong if they enforced the covering of the head upon a non-church member and woman visitor having no profession of the Christian faith. I said she must relate the matter at our church meeting. This spirit of legalism naturally took me back. Here was a young woman in severe distress, needing the mercy and love of God as revealed in Jesus Christ, and all Mrs. Everett seemed to be concerned was with the wearing of a hat. I knew the principle of a believing woman dressing modestly and being in subjection to her own husband and covering her head in worship. I also knew the principle of a woman not exercising authority over the man or teaching a man. But this action of Mrs. Everett, to use the phrase, took the biscuit. I was a man and was here being instructed by a woman, Mrs. Everett, to order or instruct a visiting unbelieving female to wear a hat, in order to uphold the principle that it was a shame for a woman to worship God without a head covering. This covering, according to the Scripture, was to show the angels she was in subjection to the man, and not usurping authority over him. Mrs. Everett missed the whole point of the gospel, and in her religious zeal to maintaining an outward form of religion, transgressed the rules she sought to maintain. This religious spirit was not of God, and I believed the gospel needed to be preached to set men free from such darkness. But who would do this? The above citation is written to demonstrate and show that the outward religious practice of a head covering can be outwardly correct, but for the wrong principle and motive. This does not mean we should discard the practice and custom. The head of every man is Christ, and so his physical natural head must not be covered in the worship of God. This indication is to angels as well as to men, and he is under Christ's rule directly. The woman is under her husband's rule, and so this is signified by her physical natural head being covered with a veil or covering. I have noticed that when the wrong view is held and the way of speaking used, everyone ought to be covered, then it leads to a person to look to an organisation for approval and financial support, and not to the Lord. Such people begin then to realise that if they do certain things or act in certain ways, then the society with whom they are working may disapprove of them and threaten them to withdraw support. A man who is under Christ will know the right way to walk and to act in any given situation if he is to be led by the Spirit of Christ. The moment a man looks to an organisation or friends for support, he may fall into the trap and try to please man in order to gain acceptance and support. This is the natural way, and so he cannot walk by faith. The natural man perceives not the things which are spiritual. The natural man does not depend on God, but his own carnal wisdom. The natural man goes against the way of faith. An example of this error, of men looking to man and women taking the lead and getting it wrong, can be found in the extract from the Daily Diary of the Trojan Horse International Mission, Tulip Fields Incorporated, December 25th, 2002. Extract. I went to see Olga Robertson at her home on the reservation of the Bureau of Corrections at New Billerby Prison in Muntinlupa, and had a meal with her friend. Olga had arrived from America and shared with me some of her experiences. She was a woman, religious volunteer, RVO, working in New Billerby Prison. I gave her a copy of my book, Trojan Warriors. She asked me if all the men that had written their testimonies were born again. I stated to her that I was not going to judge them, but they must stand by what they have written themselves. I stated that I had not changed a word, even though Gordon Smith wanted me to remove from Hector McQuader's testimony his reference to tulip and hard Calvinism, as he called it. He wanted to make a testimony acceptable to all men and not to cause offence. I had to say no to this and maintained we were not to do that, as that would change his testimony. If this happens, he would be like the Pope of Rome, seeking to alter things to please men. Olga told off one of her men helpers who was wearing a hat in her house. She's very curt with him. What did he think he was doing wearing his hat in her room? I was amazed how he obeyed her without question. And so I asked Olga, did she cover her head when worshipping God? She said no, and looked at me with a question mark on her face. The point I was making was that the covering of the head of a man when in the presence of God in worship was a dishonour to his head, who is Jesus the Lord, this being the Apostle Paul's argument and case. However, Olga Robertson was taken offence at this man wearing a hat in her house and told him off by saying it dishonoured her by wearing his hat in her dining room. The Apostle Paul goes on to say that if a woman did not cover her head in the presence of God in worship, then she dishonoured her head. That's the man. Her defiant no told me a lot. This situation reminded me of Mrs. Everett in my book, The Beaten Crisis. The spiritual man walks the way of faith, depending upon God, and the light of his word and spirit directs him in every situation. It is the way of faith. Our walk must be by faith. The walk of faith goes against the natural man and way of carnal nature. We often have to reprove silently by doing the right thing at the right time, regardless of what people think. In such a walk, the believer is often alone, but not alone as the Lord is with him. When men find themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering what will this person or that person think of me, if I do or say or do the approved thing, then this is where Satan has got you. If you find yourself not doing things which you know to be right before God and proper because you feel others may disapprove of you, then that is Satan ensnaring you so that you will become ineffectual in your work for God. We are told to resist the devil and he will flee from you. It is put as a real proposition that we are called to leave this world. This includes the world of carnal religious people as well, and daily follow Christ. We are required to put away former things which are not of God to follow Christ. Our drugs, our lying, our bad ways to walk with Christ. The religious sinner must also put away his formal dead religion to follow Christ. We all must take up our cross and follow Christ, as it would be wrong to encourage a drug-dependent user of drugs or a homosexual to continue his ways, or for a drinker with drink problems to remain drinking like a fish. So, in the same way, it will be wrong to encourage a religious sinner to continue in his or her idolatry and false religion. They must leave their sinful ways, just as a drug-dependent and drunkard and sexual deviant must leave their carnal ways. They must do it today. We are all required to walk by faith. Religious sinners exist as well as irreligious sinners exist. All need to be saved from themselves and forsake their world to follow Christ. This was written when I was in Cern in Coveing near Seville on a Trojan horse mission to Spain, the 4th of May, Saturday, and was amended in the Philippines on the 5th of December 2002 and the 1st of January 2003.